Today I want to talk a bit about one particular bizarre feature of Victorian mourning custom, and it's a small part of a kind of bigger trend which we can start off as thinking it dates right back to medieval, early modern times, and this idea of memento mori, which literally means remember you will die. And it's, in this case, memento mori is to do with objects, which are things to do with death that people carry around with them. And they can be little skull and crossbones designs on objects, for instance. And a lot of things that are reminders of particular dead people. And something that kind of carries part of them with you. And we think that it's a bit odd for some of them. We think it's a bit grotesque for some of them. But you have to remember that when somebody dies now, we have a lot of photographs and a lot of video sometimes and a lot of ephemera that's to do with them, which Victorian people simply didn't have. In the early period, there was a good chance you didn't have a photograph at all. So having anything which was a continuation of something that is theirs was a slightly different matter for them. One of those things that they use to be close to people is hair jewellery. Jewellery made from the hair from the head of the dead person. And I think hair is a fascinating thing because it doesn't rot at anywhere near the speed the rest of the body does. And that gives it a sort of a symbolism of immortality and a symbolism that it connects to the essence of that person and that in some way that person is still there. It's something you can keep that's part of them that isn't going to decay. It doesn't have a sort of negative sense that it does for us of shorn hair. It's a much more positive, personal, intimate object. And the idea of wearing jewellery from it goes way back. John Donne mentions it in a couple of his poems, so that's in the 16th, 17th century. But it does definitely become more popular in the 19th. It's said that Victoria always wore a lock of Albert's hair, and that's not just after he died as part of her mourning. She wore a lock of his hair from the day that they got engaged and wore it in a piece of jewellery. And perhaps that helped start this trend of wearing hair jewellery. She certainly wore it a lot. I don't know about all the time. Mind you, she did also have her children's baby teeth made into jewellery. You can still see images of they're like little flowers with little baby teeth in the middle as the sepals of the flower. They're really quite peculiar. But yeah, it becomes a bit of a trend to make things from the hair of the dead and incorporate a piece of it into your jewellery, which you could wear after your period of full mourning when you weren't supposed to wear any jewellery at all, and it's a bit where you can wear jet, but then you can start bringing in this, I forget the exact way around that works, but there's a point at which you can start wearing hair jewellery as well. And in a way, it's better than what went before. In 1800, you'd be more likely to wear objects with skulls and crossbones or hourglasses on, which is more of a sort of generalised reminder of death, rather than a specific memento in relation to an individual. And I'm going to briefly move you on to my pictures, you see, because that's the only way I can think to do it, like that. So you could just keep them in a book like that. Those are all little plaited hair braids. But more likely, you're going to make jewellery out of it. And one particular style was this kind of thing, which those are, it's been sort of very carefully positioned and painted to make actual little pictures, which is quite bizarre. And then the picture goes in the locket. More commonly, you'd just have sections of hair like that, kind of plaited and twisted around. Or, more fancy, this kind of thing, which all of that is made on these sort of special pieces of equipment, which are quite marvellous, that allow you to shape all of the hair into these beautiful kind of tubes and balls, and then make your jewellery and your little acorn shapes from all of that. So that's the kind of thing that I'm talking about in what's to follow, okay? So there you go. Now you know the sort of thing that we are talking about. So yeah, patterned into braids, put in the shapes of feathers, flowers, crosses, rosettes, trapped in glass, trapped in crystal. Longer strands can be turned into a sort of lace type effect, and those hollow tubes are kind of a sort of French knitting, or they can be. Preparation of your hair is important. So there are experts that do this. The fine work is a real specialist craft. You start off by boiling the hair in soda water for 15 minutes. Then you sort it into length and sort of divide it into the sections that you're going to actually use. And then you have a wooden form and you put the hair sections on bobbins, and it's much like lace making then, or a similar craft to that. You kind of twist them over using the form and using the bobbins and pinning the bobbins in place, and with weights to keep each of them, keep vertical nice and straight. And when you've done all of that, then you boil it some more, and then you dry it, you take it from the mould and you stiffen it with a glue or a lacquer and join the pieces together to make the different shapes that you want. So it's a complicated business, and some of them are incredibly fine work. The first people doing it really in Victorian times are very often goldsmiths who are trying to create something sort of unique for the upper class. So there's a lot of wig makers who are out of work in the early 19th century because wigs are going out of fashion rapidly. So you've got all these people who are very good at working with hair, who are looking for a new way to use that skill. So they get together with goldsmiths to make these unique products. One of the most skilled is a chap called Anthony Foray of Hanover Street. He's from Switzerland, and he advertises that he is the artist in hair and jewellery by appointment to the Queen. Most of the work, of course, would not be done by him. Most of the work would be done by young women, as is often the way. There are a few pattern books survive of these. And isn't that the Jeweller's Book of Patterns in Hair, in hair work rather, which has a whole load of rather beautiful engravings of all the different styles that you can have, and all sorts of things, brooches, rings, watch chains, guards, necklets, lockets, bracelets, cufflinks, all sorts of things. That's from 1864. Yeah, you could have cufflinks. You could have hair braided into your fob watch chain. You could put it into objects as well, like into as a painting, as a piece of wall art, or into a box lid. So you have the sort of sealed glass with a little picture in it, and like those early ones, you could one way you could do it is chop it up really, really fine and mix it in with the paint, and get it so fine that you could actually paint with it, in effect. And obviously you can mix different colours of hair for different effects. You can put alongside gemstones for different effects, and it's big business, this, because once you've done this process of making it, boiling it and shaping it and lacquering it and so on, it can be very strong. And yet, because it's these sort of hollow tubes, it's quite light, and that means you could make quite elaborate shapes. You could make big fancy earrings out of it without it pulling down too much, because it's it's just hair, it's really light. And in fact, it was briefly so popular as a form of jewellery that even though most people would associate it with the dead, you could just do it as a hobby as well. You could, buy a kit, especially in America. There were women who would buy a kit and buy a magazine with instruction on how to do it, and have as a hobby turning their own hair into jewellery to wear themselves or give as gifts to each other, that sort of thing. So it's not entirely all about the mourning, just mostly. And this crops up in fiction, as you might expect. Wilkie Collins seems particularly fond of it. There's more than one instance where there's a plot that turns on the identification of whose hair is it in somebody's bracelet that was made out of hair. Charlotte Young has pious heroines who say that they would rather wear jewellery made out of their dead parents or dead brother or sister's hair than wear gold and diamonds, and saying that is supposed to be a mark of how wonderfully what their inner value is as people. You do have to be careful what you do with that hair. There is a scandal about this, because obviously if you want something really fancy, you're not doing it yourself, you've got to send it to a company to do it for you, to turn it into a jewellery or artwork. And there are companies out there, it was discovered, who would sometimes replace that hair with other people's hair, or even with horse hair. So the thing is, some people's hair is harder to work with than others. It might not be long enough, it might be damaged, or just difficult to, it might be very curly, difficult to keep straight to do the job. So if you get that, some companies might just decide to cheat and instead lift off with, swap it out for somebody else's hair. Or horse hair is far easier to work with, so you could just do that. So all the companies stress that, you know, they would never do that kind of thing. They would always use the actual hair of the person. But the thing is, hair taken from someone after they've died tends to be quite brittle. It's better to take the hair from the person while they're alive. And so you can take it out while you're alive to practice with, but it's better to send some while you're alive to the jeweller in advance for when they're going to need it later. So Queen Victoria did this, for instance. Queen Victoria lodged some of her own hair and that of Albert and that of all of her children with her jewellers in advance, and had it locked away very safely to guarantee its authenticity, so that when the time came to make jewellery from it, it would be both authentically theirs and it would be in better quality, even though it's been sat in a drawer for a while, because it came from a living person. It will be in better nick than it would be if it had come from the person after they were dead. Other people actually lodged their hair with their solicitors in advance of their death, ready for this eventuality, which I think is brilliant. It goes out of style, comes back in style again, as these things do. There seems to be a bit of a shift in what you'd actually do with it. So these kind of really elaborate sort of chain designs are more mid-century, 1870s through 1880s. Then it calms down a little bit, and then it maybe comes back again. The Washington Evening Star in 1906 reports, "The old and quaint idea of wearing the hair of a relative in a bit of jewellery is again in vogue." So this is 1906, remember. "For so doing, the most charming device is the crystal heart. It is made of beveled crystal set in platinum and surrounded with 13 to 15 medium-sized diamonds." I think this would rather go against the point that Charlotte Young was making about wearing the jewellery instead of wearing the diamonds, but never mind that. "On the underside of the crystals, the initials or coat of arms of the wearer should be done in silver, and at the very back is placed the lock of hair. This is laid in loosely. It is never braided or woven as in years gone by." So it becomes more about just having a piece of hair in a very fancy locket rather than the hair being the feature and indeed the entire structure of the jewellery itself. But I think they were a little optimistic at that point. It falls out of fashion, and certainly falls very much out of fashion over World War I and into the 20s. There are various suggestions as to why that is. Shorter hair, a much lighter, simpler fashion style in general, that funeral homes are doing things a bit differently, and also perhaps that these hair becomes associated with sort of dustiness and dirt. And I guess it would be quite difficult. You'd have to dust them quite regularly, and that's associated with poor health. So there's a few reasons there why it might have gone out of fashion. I think that they're quite beautiful, but perhaps that's just the period of time where it starts to get seen as a bit morbid to carry around actual bits of a person with you. And briefly then to go to hair, but from the other side of things. So you're not taking somebody's hair and wearing it, but that you're leaving hair behind. It's quite common at this period, as well as taking some of that person's hair to make jewellery, to leave some of your own hair in the coffin of your loved one, so they can take hair with them. So for instance, Keats, where the poet Keats, when he was buried, had a lock of Fanny Brawn's hair buried with him. When painter John Horsley's wife dies, 1852, Elvira Horsley, she had made a bag, knowing that she was dying. She had made a special red velvet bag, and in it she had cut some of his hair and some of all the children's hair, and she had labelled each of those locks with the name and the date, and then she took that with her when she died. So in her grave she had pre-made in advance these locks of all of him and all of his family. You can see it in fiction as well. It's a plot point in Wuthering Heights, actually, that Catherine's body, she has a locket, and Heathcliff goes and takes out of the locket the hair of Linton and swaps it with his own. So there's definitely some kind of connection to the person that hair contains your essence in a way that makes that a very meaningful and powerful act. Dante Rossetti, of course, goes a little bit different, as you would expect. When Lizzie Siddal dies, who's his wife and has been his muse, she had tremendous long red hair, and he wound a book of his poetry into her hair, tangled it in, just before she was buried. And she was buried in Highgate Cemetery and left there. And then 7 years later, he decided that he was in a bit of an artistic rut, and in any case short of money, and he could really do with getting that book of poetry back from inside the grave. So he went to her in the dead of night and took the book back. But when he did, he was shocked to see that his wife's locks were still a beautiful bright red, and he thought had actually grown longer yet, as if she had never been dead. And that just shows that the sort of vibrancy and vitality that hair is thought to have long after death, and that one way of carrying that with you would be instead to turn it into jewellery. So there you go. Bit of a shorter one today, but got some pretty pictures in, so that counts for something, I hope. I want to have a go at making some hair jewellery. I've got some horsehair somewhere. At some point I'm going to sit and see how hard these shapes are to make. And I'll let you know the results if I ever get around to doing that, because I think it would be fascinating. And yeah, I reckon there's some mileage in you know, cutting a little bit of this while I'm alive and turning it into my own hobby jewellery. Don't need to wait till I'm dead, and it's all good.